So, you need to do a research project that has some sort of Canadian angle to it. This could be because you're looking into politics or the government. It could be something related to our geography or our history, or it could be related to an ongoing issue that you've seen in the news or read or spoken about in class. So you do the same thing that you always do. You open your favorite database, type in the search words related to your research question, and then add the word Canada onto the end. Unfortunately, although this technique has worked for you many times in the past, you find that you're just not getting many answers, and the answers you're getting aren't robust enough to help you with your project. Now what? When students come to me with questions like this, the first thing I like to ask is, do you really need a Canadian perspective to answer your question? The reason I ask this is because in many cases, geography and nationality don't have any impact on the answer to the question being asked. For example, while you might be interested in barriers being faced by immigrant mothers when they enter the workforce in Canada, many of those barriers are the same regardless of whether their context is Canadian or American. This isn't to say that there are no differences, because certainly there are, but it does mean that research based in the United States could be, and likely is, relevant to your research question. Because of this, limiting your search to only Canada can have a negative impact on the overall results on the overall results you retrieve. On the other hand, if your research topic has to do with something like the Canadian healthcare system or the Canadian government, then that Canadian perspective is very important and very specific to Canada, and there are ways that you can include it in your search. Unfortunately, however, these techniques aren't perfect, and it's important to understand why before implementing them in your search. The challenges, or downsides, to including a Canadian perspective in your search are really twofold. First, research about Canada and documents relating to Canada make up a relatively small percentage of the overall research and documentation available on any given topic, simply because we have a relatively small population. And second, particularly in the peer-reviewed literature, it's fairly rare for researchers to explicitly state the geographic location or context of the research being performed in an item's searchable record, so in the title or the abstract. This is because many researchers want to emphasize the broader applicability of their work instead of creating a false illusion that its applicability is limited to the geographic location in which it was performed. These two things taken together mean that your research pool is fairly small to begin with, and that even a very thorough search that includes many synonyms related to Canada is unlikely to capture everything Canadian, simply because that available research is not indexed geographically. And unfortunately, the solutions we have for this problem aren't perfect, as I've mentioned already. There is simply no good way to isolate purely Canadian content in a search without losing at least some content that might otherwise be available and relevant. That being said, there are several approaches you can take to maximize your retrieval of Canadian content in a search, and that's what the rest of this video will be about. Starting with databases. So when you're searching academic databases, identifying Canadian content is best achieved using a search string, that includes as many Canadian terms as possible. So up until a few years ago, I used to recommend to students that they type in the word Canada and then the names of all the provinces and territories as sort of like a middle ground to at least including, provinces and territories without trying to name every single city, town, and geographic breakdown of Canada, which is really not feasible. However, very generously, some librarians at the University of Alberta went ahead and did a great deal of this work for us. In the notes below this video, you will find an adaptation of their Canada search filter, which is really just a big chunk of searchable text that you can copy and paste into most databases, into just the regular search box that you would enter any other search term into. This filter includes the word Canada, the provinces and territories, as well as the 100 most populous centers in the country. So most of our major cities, and even some of the smaller ones. Using it is sort of the quickest and easiest way to do a reasonably thorough search of Canadian literature that exists. I do want to emphasize one more time that no matter how detailed and thorough this search string is, you will end up missing content related to Canada simply because they don't use any of those terms that are geographic in their titles and abstracts, which are the things that you're searching. But it is the best solution that I have. As a quick aside, I will also mention that you shouldn't use the geographic limiters that are built into the database, so those ones that appear usually on the left-hand side of the search. They consistently retrieve fewer results and are just not that good at identifying geography. Okay, so that's databases. Another way to locate Canadian content is to use a Canadian content database, like the Canadian Business and Current Affairs database, most commonly called CBCA or CBCA Complete. While the name of this database would imply that it's a business database, and it technically kind of is, it has a lot of general Canadian content as well. It also has the benefit of having lots of different types of content, so in addition to peer-reviewed literature, it also contains things like trade journals, blogs, podcasts, and wire feeds. I really like it as a broadly good place to find Canadian content in an information landscape that is generally dominated by our neighbors to the south. Grey Literature, or Greylit, is another tool in your toolbox for retrieving Canadian content. It's probably the one I use most often, and to greatest effect. There are lots of ways to obtain Canadian research and Canadian perspectives in the Grey Literature, and these ways can be more thoroughly examined in my video on that topic. And I've provided a link to that video in the description below this one. Census and government data. So one subset of Canadian content that is often underrated and underused is the publicly available census and government data that is produced by our government and shared with people. The Government of Canada has a very, very robust statistics and data arm called Statistics Canada, or StatsCan, and much of this data is freely available online. For example, it's relatively easy to locate the census profile for a given city or town on the StatsCan website. And these profiles include hundreds of data points on topics ranging from individual and household incomes, to languages spoken, to the types and numbers of households in a region. It's also fairly easy to just use Google to search for aggregate Canadian data on other topics. For instance, information related to childhood fitness and activity rates, or the population's perspective on issues of the day, or even such things as like monthly business openings and closures across the country are all easily found online using Google and the word StatsCan. If you're interested in specifically locating and using publicly available data through StatsCan, I highly recommend checking out the Google Advanced Search feature and using their domain searcher and just typing in like statcan.gc.ca to tell Google to just search that website for the information that you're looking for. Just helps you to narrow down from the millions of things that Google is going to give you to just a manageable number that is produced by StatsCan for your uses. If you want more detailed access to Canadian census or government data, we do have that available through what we call public use microdata files, or PUMFs. These are a bit harder to access. They do require a bit more expertise. So if you need more information on how to do that, you can contact me, and I will either help you myself, or I'll direct you to our data expert if your question exceeds my expertise. Okay, so quick recap. Obtaining a Canadian perspective on a research topic is something that should only be undertaken when the research topic is significantly impacted by the geographic context in which that topic is situated. And it's important to be aware that when you do isolate to just a Canadian context, no matter how well you perform your search or how thorough you are going to lose or miss content. However, in cases where Canadian perspective is clearly relevant and needed to best inform your research, there are a number of things you can do to maximize the information you retrieve on your topic. And these things include using the Canadian search filter created by the U of A, which is in the description below this video. Searching databases that emphasize Canadian content, like CBCA Complete. Searching the Grey literature using Google and techniques detailed in my video on Grey literature, which again is linked to in the description below this video. And making use of census and government data that is publicly available or available through UNB libraries by contacting an expert. So thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at rwithers@unb.ca. Have a nice day.